Hello, people. This week I read Vampire Hunter D Razor of Gales. This is the second in what's apparently a very long line of books. But so far they're fantastic. I thoroughly enjoy them. This is a extremely well written book. How does it start? Wintry sunlight fell from high in a hollow sky to the valley below, bright enough to trick a smile out of you, and cold enough to empty your lungs in a cloudy white chain of coughs. It's just so mood building, right? What is it? Wintry sunlight. When you don't have to say wintry. You just say sunlight. But sunlight sounds too bright. If you add winter, something like this in front of it, it changes it. A hollow sky. These are cloud sky. These are sort of upbeat typically. Hollow, winter, tricks. They're negative. They pull you down a little bit. I mean, and it's just this is, I think, first paragraph. Empty your lungs in a cloudy white chain of coughs. It's describing that little puff, right? It's cold. It's biting. And yet there's something pleasant about the look. All at once. Absolute tremendous writing. And our author carries this, of course, throughout the entire book. So what you have is, what is it, an economy of words here. You don't have to have, what is it? You don't always have to have a super fatso book, right? Sometimes you can get way more out of way less. I sometimes see word choice like a painting, right? Where sometimes some of the elements start to color your perception of other elements. What do I mean? Okay, so if you use expensive paints back in the 1700s or the 11th century or wherever, you wouldn't paint something useless, frivolous, right? So then you start to look and like, wow, this character has blue wrapped on him that was made out of this gem. So this person, this thing must be more important than just a normal baker, right? Or whatever the case may be. It's the same if on subject matter, right? So if you're Leonardo da Vinci and you put all this crafting into these three characters, right? I don't look at it and say, oh, he drew a lady and two babies. Because you don't need to put that much effort into a regular lady and three babies. You start to go, oh, that must be the Virgin Mary and the baby Jesus and John the Baptist, right? This kind of, you start to upgrade your own perceptions of what you're even looking at. And I do the same with good writing. If you're taking all the effort to put all these great words together, I'm going to look at what you're putting out a little different. You lean on it sometimes. You see if the theories hold up. You chew on the subject matter. This kind of thing. Now, I mention that because on top of the other fun fantasy elements I'm going to mention, there is sort of a heavier subject that happens in this one as compared to maybe the first book. This may be normal for all the other books, but it came up in this one, so. The subject is sort of, what do we say? It's sexual in nature, sexual assault specifically, rape, is described in this book. Now, again, I say the writer is a good writer. So it isn't overly described, I would say. I'm assuming I could find a romance novel that does more details, but it is effectively described, right? It is impactful. But it isn't, I feel like there's a solid point for it, right? It's, what is it? It starts to not be colored good or bad, but we're trying to tackle sort of a more globalized issue. I'm just saying it early because, you know, it might be a trigger for some people. Some people might not want anything to do with it at all. I would understand that. So, you know going in that if that's an issue for you, you could avoid this book because it doesn't shy away from it in that sense. This isn't a kid's book, I would say. I wouldn't recommend this for kids. Maybe not even teenagers. But, that'll vary by parents. But I'm mentioning that, and I will go in more depth, I guess, later. Our narrator, again with the cool writing, he is actually sort of like a narrator. It's a person outside of the events who just describes to you certain things in a not novel manner, if that makes sense. It's almost like a play or an old radio show. Our Vampire Hunter D will do something mysterious. And it's like he's a play-by-play guy. And he's on the side and he's like, well, what does that mysteriousness mean? We don't know. Or two people will, look at each other and he'll describe like sort of the behind the scenes. If they were shy, he'll say it wasn't because of XYZ, but probably but actually this other reason. It's a cool break in the flow, and it's unusual. I don't see this type of storytelling used much. It's very effective. I think if more people used this style rather than first person, we'd have a lot more good books, if I'm being honest. People mess up first person way too much. RD is coming into this town. This town has a problem with a particular noble. That's what they call the vampires, the nobility. This has such the great world building. The idea that vampires took over the world for some 5,000 to 7,000 years, and then they decayed, and then it's been like 3,000, 4,000 years since then. So we have this weird mix of ruin of like science fiction meets way out there fantasy. Such a fun, what do we say, milieu. This great mix of elements. The problem is they might have a vampire that can walk in the daylight, which would be terrible. He goes into a ruins, which we go back to quite a lot. A lot of our story centers around these ruins. In the ruins, he fights a pixie. And okay. Pixies, this was a pixie farm, it said. And this was a particularly aggressive, evil pixie versus some that aren't so aggressive. They say, because the vampires were ruling for X amount of thousands of years. They then found these creatures of myth that were actually the quote real. If vampires are real, pixies and goblins got to be real. They would then experiment on them for various purposes of their own, right? And sort of the experiments then would just be released. They have no real issue. They could kill a pixie easy, but they're sort of starting to be at odds with humans, so there's no real need for them to go clear out the results of their experiments. And then thousands of years go by and we are left with these. And it's really cool to see, what does it say? Some pixies can like marionette people, right? Control them. You have you could use some other type of fantastical creature to control a unicorn, to clear out tracts of land. You could grab Grim hens, is what they call them, to make uranium pellets. And you're like, the levels on this world building, just with a few short sentences, just go way out to the horizon. It would be one thing to say again, a unicorn is way over here in Fantasyland. Clearing a field is very realistic, and you smash them together. A chicken is very real. Uranium is very scientifical. But a chicken making uranium pellets is way fantastical. You smashed them together. Not only did you smash them together, you presented them to me with a human element. I can imagine people with 25 Grim chickens with big gloves on harvesting the uranium pellets, because uranium's a useful element. In a world where this sort of genetic modification can happen, I'm sure there's other tech. We probably run buildings off the uranium pellets the same ways, people used to run their house off coal. And your mind, you just race out. You just race out in this really great way. Such great world building. This also shows me some of the rules, right? So we have, before he came, I guess 10 years before he came, 4 children were taken. I guess up to these ruins. And then released. Now, people getting taken is not unusual. There are vampires in this world. Peppered out. They'll show up, they'll take people, then you hire a vampire hunter to kill the vampire. Or try and kill him yourself. So that part's not unusual. And it gives me a lot of the sort of the day-to-day dealing with this. There are books that were written on the intricacies of this. So if you get taken by a vampire and he bites you and he's trying to make you a familiar or semi one of them, this kind of thing, right? The bite, you will get some of the powers of that whatever vampire. If that one can have psychic ability on people, you sort of have psychic ability. If it can turn into a bat, you could turn into a bat. Now, obviously, then you're not a full-blown vampire, so you can last less long as a bat. You can affect people less mentally. Your strength isn't as strong. Obviously, then all of these things grow with time. If you're left, the longer you stay, the more powerful you become. Also, if you kill the vampire that turned your person, they're released from the bond. All the sort of rules of vampire are at play here, but you see how they manifest in sort of a real world with real people. So we have 10 years ago where 4 kids were taken and returned seemingly unharmed. But in a society that understands what these abductions mean, they're always looked at a little bit sideways. Like, maybe something's going on here. Maybe something we don't know. Maybe they're not normal humans. So this sort of the build up to our story. Add to this, we're in a small frontier town. And they give me the information that the revolutionary government, the one in charge in the capital, won't let you leave your little town. You're forced to stay unless you have permission to move around. You can visit, but you have to go back. Because they're trying to repopulate the world, right? And if I move a settlement out here, then those people can fight sort of the monsters off, make civilization start to happen. I'm like, that's just interesting. I can imagine these people living in this world. Well, on top of this, they will select luminaries from these towns, right? If you have a kid that's exceptional in some way, he gets to come back to the capital city, get all the perks of that, and your town gets some money and prestige. One of our captive kids grows up to be one of these such persons. Lena. She's very intelligent, and she's the town's hope. Now, she is the one who these assaults happen to, right? And it says the age is 17. But not going into the legalese because, right, age of consent varies throughout the world. Some cultures think such and such is fine, others think it's atrocious. I'm not getting into that. It is what it is. I sort of focus through the book. Now, again, you can have some books where they cross a line. I don't think this book did cross that line. In the setup that they're giving with these frontiers, they'll say certain, maybe less than ideal situations end up being necessary. A la a guy who's sort of way too old versus a semi-young person. Might pair up and have kids and be completely fine, but you need population in these areas. New people aren't allowed to come in. So you see that. You also get the sense from the book that even at 17, she's not a child. So it's not pedo levels, I would say. It's more assault, sexual assault. And applying one would apply more weight to the story, and then it'd have to function the way it needs to function. So if you're telling a true to life history of a serial killer, you might come into contact with, horrendous things this person did. But that storyteller doesn't have to balance anything. These are true facts, right? Versus a Stephen King, if he puts in various actions, his story now has to balance it. So if you're randomly putting in pedophilia in your story, the subject matter elsewhere has to make that worth it for the reader to have sort of had to deal with. So in that sense, our author's not going into that realm. That's not the sense that I get. Age notwithstanding. That's why I said I'm not going to bother with the ages. She gets assaulted. And like I was saying earlier with the painting, you start to get a sense of a higher idea this person's trying to get across, rather than, people are horrible. And that leads us into sort of one of the bigger concepts in the book, which is we break down about vampires themselves. And that it says they're tied to the night, and then humans are tied to the day, the light. That in their genes, somehow genetically, they get pulled, that the power of dark empowers them, that maybe at the core, they want to, kill people, to be vicious in the way that they end up vicious. Or maybe it's the time that they live, that they live 2,000 years that makes them vicious, right? We start to ask these type of questions. And obviously, Arlena being tied somehow to some ruins makes you start to wonder, is she completely victim? Right? Because we all know vampires, at least in the classical sense, have an aura, sexual aura about them. They draw people to them. Right? And what is it? You can only live so long with temptation. But then submitting to temptation, again, is the evil. And it you then manifest it more and more, etc., etc. All these sorts of higher concepts start to build in your head from this sort of action. Lena, at some point, and again, like I was saying about the painting, that good writing led me not to sort of shut off earlier in the book when the assaults were happening. Because we didn't get to Lena's crimson dream. She's dreaming of this red coming at her constantly, attacking, and her core self being against it. But what does it say? It's like being against going over the fence, but over the fence is what you want, if that makes sense. It's this kind of weird twist where she's like, if I went to it, if I let the crimson take over, I would belong in the world. I would finally have a sense of belonging, that things would be right. But her core sense, the other part, knows that that right is wrong. Right? A very odd way to be. Mohit, a few of the sort of pieces that I liked, and then I'll finish off with what happens at the end. We have a man named Cyrus Fern who tries to save his daughter from a vampire, by all apparent looks. But how he does it is he has two baskets. He drops the lids on them, and out come, monsters. One's like a 10-foot tall electric spider. One is some kind of a cloud with lightning coming out of it, this kind of thing. I'm like, and that's what he does. He farms up mythical animals and trains them to be defenses, and then sells these trained animals. It's such a wild pairing. Animal trainer meets fantastical beast. And he finds a vampire with him and sort of wins. It's very cool. The ruins themselves, we end up delving into them. And of course, they're vampires. And if you know anything about vampires, they love to class the joint up. So the way they describe it is you see those old Gilded Age buildings with just ornate stairwells and arches and all of this mess. It's just this beautiful classical style. Austria at the height of its power, just pretty for the sake of pretty. Classical, old school. But that in amongst all of this will be rows of technology, of computers, of these weird beakers, and it's a science lab. And again, typically in science fiction, science labs are clean and sterile. But to mesh the two, right? To mesh the classical with the technological. I just don't see it often. I just don't see it often, and it's done really well. They say they find an electro analyzer, a matter converter, flasks, bizarre goblets filled with liquids, positron brains. And then you remember as you read that this is a ruin. The stone outside's fallen apart. This is a building that's 3,000 years old. And that lends itself to almost sort of, a greater awe. Like when they show an exploration of an Egyptian tomb, and like there's a pot of beans in the side, that pot of beans has been sitting there for 2,000 years. It kind of starts to blow your mind. That same energy gets applied here in the way he describes it. So it's sort of, you get this aura about the nobility when you see all this tech that's still usable, that's still functioning, right? Just sitting there. We have, on top of that sort of story going along, the other track of our story is our vampire hunter D. Cool as all get out. Beautiful, they say constantly. That even men would swoon, right? He's so good looking. You never lose sort of a track. I say the author never lets you lose track of the power of this individual. At one point he's getting attacked, and he gets thrown in the water, and this sort of tentacle monster is grabbing him, and he's able to just by force, by strength, walk out of the water with these tentacles hanging on him. And it's, what is it to say? The strength of 50 men in this beautiful, dark, mysterious, pale skin package. And it's, what did we say? It's power scaling. If he's not strong, then the enemies he's fighting isn't strong. You mess up your levels. But if you overblow his strength, right? Like, so he just cuts everything in half, or everything's too easy, or you don't have characters who react appropriately to what they're seeing, then you start to lose where he fits. So, right? So the men are seeing the strength of 50 men in one person and feeling the awe that would come from meeting a nobility, a true vampire, feeds the story in this wonderful way without sidetracking us too far from the meat of the story that we're wanting to see. He's there. The monsters aren't even almost a problem for him. What he starts to have is what they call a presence, a second voice in his head that it's saying he almost doesn't consciously speak with, but he's sort of communicating this kind of way. And we've already had a couple of times where we're having sort of mental psychic battles in this book. So you're never sure of what this presence is, but you start to get a sense, right? Okay, I think I have a couple more things that I just have to mention. This one specifically. D, I think he's racing back towards the ruins. Gets caught in a, what do they say? A closed dimension. Now again, it sounds wild, but the book, the writing, the world building really can carry these sort of outlandish concepts very well. It does not interfere. What is it? It does not break the verisimilitude, as we like to say. He gets stuck in a closed dimension. What he does to get out of it is what is the Carmichael, the face in his hand, which they have yet to explain, mind you. The face in his hand says is that he is taking life to give life. He gathers all of the elements, the wind, the dirt, fire, and then I think water. For water, he uses his blood. But what I think he's doing, I think they let it be vague on purpose, but it's, you know when they make like an effigy of somebody, or voodoo makes a little doll of you, and then you can poke it and they feel the poke, right? It's like that kind of a thing, that kind of an angle, where because he's a vampire or dhampir, which is half, and so he can drink other people's blood. They haven't shown him take blood, so I don't know where. Maybe he animal blood. He does little vials of it, so I'm not sure where he's getting it. In any case, he's not attacking people for it. But it's still blood that's not, sort of homegrown, homemade, his blood. And so he pours it in there and starts it on fire. I think that sort of counts as a person, an entity, somehow like this, right? It's some kind of weird magic. But it's enough to throw the dimension in chaos. But here's the cool part. You would think, was this just like a wizard waving his wand? Like, no. He sets it off at an appropriate time, charges at the loop point at full speed, and then everything starts to break apart. And then it describes that at the same time in the lab, something sort of breaks. What is it? The auto repair circuits kind of start to go haywire. And so it's trying to fix the machine that's making the closed dimension. And so we have the auto repair machine, construction fighting destruction, because the dimension is breaking apart on the back end. But the fact that they tied it, I say they, I mean the author, ties it to a machine. So like it's feeding the myth of this history of the vampires and the tech they've made, while also just being kind of cool and sci-fi. It's such a slick idea. He gets sucked into like a void space. His horse gets disintegrated down to molecules. And as he's looking around, because it says it went full power on the rest of the facility and then started to draw on other dimensions. And then it says at the same time, what does it say? At the same time, 1945, a bunch of fighter pilots flying over Bermuda get sucked into a dimension that opens. And the moment he said it, the moment it said, right, I know what we're doing. And it's just, I would have never thought to add time travel into this story. I would have never thought to have a time travel vampire story that sort of works. We run through a list, right? It's those fighter pilots in 1941. Jack the Ripper gets sucked out of his time, so that's why he mysteriously stopped killing. Then it's going into the fake. 3046, an Alpha class black hole disappears, causing a lot of the head vampire scientists to be removed from their post because everyone was going to leave the planet thinking it's going to get evaporated, right? So now you're giving me fake history with real history, blending the two. He mentions one, which I'm going to look up in a minute. In 1901, Anne Moberly and someone else visiting Versailles sees Marie Antoinette just like eating a cake or something like this. Like a ghost, like a ghost encounter. And then I'm like, in my head, I'm thinking like, what does it say? Vernon Barry sees the sacred ancestor and makes a painting. I think I looked this up. I think I found a painting. I think Vernon Barry is an actual person. But it got me, I'm like, is it Jules Verne who did the time travel book? I forget what the crap it's called. Now that I'm sitting here, I can't remember the name. But like, was he like a vampire, a time traveling vampire, right? Like, how much of our history has vampires woven into it? I'm like, and it just, in the stream of the story, this thing just pops out, hits you in this magical way, and then the stream just carries on. It's just, I'm telling you, it's very, very spectacular writing. Now, again, if you don't like the heavy issues in this one, read the first one. It's also equally good. He gets to a security system. I just thought, just sideways, this was cool. Where it, what did they say? It's a material test. If you aren't the makeup of whatever the security system is, then when you pass through it, it'll turn you into something else. So if he passed through, but he could have, if the test had gone sideways, been turned into a diamond. Just like literally, I can imagine, like, instead of a force field that just blocks everything out, imagine it just lets you through, and if you scan wrong, you just become some other object. And I'm like, that's a hyper effective security system. It's also really cool technology. It's just sitting there. And then it ends with our, I think it's two of the four kids who had been kidnapped 10 years ago, who are they're now adults, or 10 years ago. Yeah. They're now adults, and it all comes to a head. Now, again, you get the sense, which is being very mysterious about, you get the sense that he is the son of Dracula, at least the half-son. And that so are these four. That somehow genetically it's Dracula trying to make the vampire that doesn't have to, what is it? The vampire that can share in the power of the light as well as the dark. The ultimate being, right? Because you hear this voice in his head. Now, the book goes out of its way to make it like a running sort of gag, like where he'll never say that his father's name, right? That he won't say Dracula's my father. It's just a cool running gag that I hope they continue with. But in this one, he won't say it. but you infer it well enough that this presence is somehow maybe Dracula, the sacred ancestor. It comes to light that it's him. He's been doing these tests, that he had this facility amongst others. And for 3,000 years, he's been kidnapping ladies. And some he'll try and have kids with. And in this facility, he tried genetically altering, right, the old genetic material, the sperm and the egg, to artificially inseminate, right? And so this computer's just showing just countless, weirdly deformed babies, some with cat eyes, some with fins, but all of them with Dracula level powers, right? The Lena and the other kid, the other people end up with these powers. She has like psychic powers. She's letting the guy have her, right? She's letting him try and impregnate her. And she's saying, I'm going to let the other one as well. It's like after maturity, the test is complete. And that she is a vampire that can walk in the daytime. But she's still a vampire. So from her perspective, she's committed to it now, right? She saw that was the internal battle. Now, they make it sort of vague whether she had a choice in this or not, right? Because what we end up with is it's not about her. It is about our vampire hunter D, and that it is about whether he chooses, right? What path? The human, the light, or the vampire, the dark? That internal struggle sort of made manifest in these people. But that he also knows, because he's been talking to this presence, who we're pretty sure is Dracula, that Dracula's like, none of the tests work. All the babies that are mutated, he says, I cleaned all of the experiments because they failed. And he's like, you're the only one that succeeded. So it's like somehow this connection to him, right? And that's why I was saying earlier where you're tied to the vampire who made you. Because what ends up happening to these is one of the guys who had been killing people melts, or starts to melt, literally starts to melt. And I'm assuming that's Dracula saying, I cut this tie. However mentally he can do that. He is Dracula, where he's like, I'm not allowing that one to exist anymore. And before he melts, he just, lasers himself to death rather than just melt. Lena takes a little longer to melt, right? She gives sort of a speech that she had this idea that her and the other guy would go to a new planet and establish a new world of, I guess, sort of in her head, the next evolution, the evolution of humans and vampires into this super being that doesn't die and has the power of light and dark. But Dracula didn't want it. Dracula could have let her live. Vampire Hunter D would have let her live, right? He's like, he says, I don't hunt if I'm not getting paid. But I think it's throughout the book you get this sense, this connection to this girl that brings more out of him than is normal. But I think that's that he senses maybe that it's his sister, right? Not that he senses it's his sister, but the sort of like an unwritten camaraderie you have with siblings. That's the gist I get by the end of it, right? But Dracula's not going to let her go. He's like, she's a failure. His idea of success is one that doesn't want to eat blood, that is a vampire, that doesn't just bend to its desire for blood. And so he melts her too. She just melts. Very sad. So in the end, you end up with this sort of... It's not the story I expected, right? It's not just like a hero journey. He comes in and saves the day. There are heavier issues that happened. But it is still fun. Again, good writing. Heavy subject matter, good writing. Okay, I think this one's a little bit disjointed. I think earlier I had my chicken making noise, but I think I got it all. I think I got what I wanted to say. Ads. All these are my books. I don't have a vampire book. Do I have a vampire book? I technically do. In any case, these are my books. Buy them if you want to support the channel, or subscribe, or just watch and enjoy. However you want to do it. All right, I'll talk to you all next week.